Pour écouter cette session en français, veuillez cliquer en bas de votre écran sur l'onglet Interprétation et sélectionner le drapeau français.
Hello, bonjour.
Habari za leo.
On behalf of ICLEI Africa, the Africa Center for Cities, Our Future Cities,
Surge Africa and the Red Cross Crescent Climate Center,
We are delighted to welcome you to the Rise Africa 2023 Action Festival.
Rise Africa is a platform that brings together thinkers, doers, and enablers
to inspire action for sustainable cities.
This is the third edition of our virtual festival.
it brings together insights, practices, and visions from across the continent.
This year's theme is The Cities We Want.
the cities we want.
the cities we want.
The cities we want.
This mirrors the African Union 2063 Agenda vision, the Africa we want.
It is a wonderful Pan-African call for transformative change.
However, the agenda does not adequately embrace urbanization as a potential positive force for improving prosperity, inclusivity, and environmental well-being on the continent.
We need more emphasis on the role of cities and local action. And this festival aims to provide inputs into this agenda.
The cities we have are
Expanding,
incomplete,
inventive,
contested,
facing impending crisis, yet brimming with potential.
The cities we want are
people-centered,
Safe and healthy.
beacons of culture,
unflinchingly modern.
And adapting to change and leading global innovation.
We'll make these cities through
Experimenting,
learning
collaborating,
and amplifying the everyday actions of people who are shaping their cities.
The festival invites you to embrace different ways of knowing,
It invites you to forge new partnerships,
Experiment with new concepts and ideas.
to seek ways to bridge science, business, policy, and the arts.
Together, let's enter this space in the spirit of poetic possibilities.
Nous venons tous de diverses cités, et c'est cela vraiment notre diversité, la force formidable de notre continent. Et pourtant, nous marchons encore sur des routes fragiles. Comment construire notre Afrique avec ce terme labile, cette allure galvaudée loin des initiatives qui pourraient de nos villes faire une place active? Et que dire? Que dire à présent de notre gestion, de l'eau que l'on gaspille parfois sans concession, des ordures recyclables mais jamais recyclées, de ces paysages admirables mais bien souvent trop gâchés? L'histoire rappelle que c'est l'Afrique qui nous rassemble et que pour la construire, il faut agir ensemble. Moi, je veux une révolution de nos villes. Je les veux plus vertes et je veux de l'accueil des cités merveilleuses. Et puis, bon pied, bon œil, au gré de leurs histoires sur les pas d'une histoire. Car nos villes, c'est l'aventure. Nos villes sont nos miroirs. Pour l'urbanisme intelligent, nos villes nous appellent et nous interpellent pour l'action maintenant.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody who has joined us. We want to say thank you for joining us on behalf of ICLEI Africa, on behalf of the African Center for Cities, Our Future Cities, Surge Africa, and the Red Cross Climate Center. We welcome you to the third and the final day of the Rise Africa 2023 Action Festival. As we enter into this joint space, I'd like to kindly request that we remain respectful of this space as a shared yet a collegial convening. Please keep your mics muted and your videos turned off except for when you're speaking or you are invited to do so by the facilitator. Dissenting opinions and views are welcome in this space. However, the disrespect of persons and personhood is not welcome. Let us share this space in the spirit of Africa Day and of Ubuntu, respectful of each other and of our communality. Still in the spirit of Africa Day, I'll also like to welcome you to this space and prompt you in the next 1 minute to celebrate Africa Day with ICLEI Africa and her partners on a Zoom shower. So my prompt is this: describe in only one word the Africa that you dream of. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is to please write into the Zoom chat, but don't yet send it. We'll count down 3, 2, 1, and we'll all send at the same time. The Africa that you dream of. And on that basis, I would ask us to please send into the Zoom now on the count as we count down to 0, 3, 2, 1, 0. Equitable, inclusive, a thriving Africa, a well-connected Africa, free Africa, inclusive and vibrant, an African continent free of corruption, prosperous, safe, people-centered, flourishing. Fantastic. And as those responses come through, can I ask you to please hold in your heart the Africa that you dream of as we listen to our speakers today tell us about the cities that we deserve, because at the end of this session, we're going to come to a time where we will together jointly as a community craft the beginnings of these cities that we deserve, which we hope to feed into a greater agenda. As a bit of background, the morning sessions over the last 3 days of this year's Rise Africa Festival has been a 3-part exploratory journey into the broader theme of the cities that we want. On day 1, we sat both comfortably and quite uncomfortably in some instances in the tension space of the cities we have, being desolate, gray spaces on the one hand, and yet on the other hand, recognizing that there are cities which are full of potential, of energy, of exuberance, and of hope. Participants at the session in day 1 were invited to think about what was the most important and urgent action which we need to take towards realizing the cities that we want. The session juxtaposed the stark reality of informality, the penalization of poverty, infrastructure deficits, the criminalization of personhoods and being because they do not conform to binary normativism, and the failure of effectively communicating the vision of where we hope to arrive as a collective. Yet still through this session, we recognize the very powerful role which women in the informal economy across the continent play as sustainers of the economy. The power of visionary and well-tailored storytelling and the emergence of our cities as a culmination of different identities, finding allies and partnerships for this realization. Yesterday, in this series, we deep dived into the cities which we want, where we were invited by Malika and Ndlovu to sit in the messiness of the middle spaces between the contextual realities of the cities that we have and the cities which we're aspiring to embrace abundance rather than lack in this space, and to reimagine this space as a space for creativity. The panelists in painting on the canvas of the cities that we want urged us towards a collective visioning. That is the we rather than the I of our cities. For so long, when we re-envision the cities we want, we think of the cities I want rather than the collective vision of the cities we want, and the role that creatives and creativity plays in moving us towards these cities. This starts from asking very important questions. Who are the users of the cities? And in responding to this, we need to unlearn the visions of the West for our cities while we continue to embrace cultural identity that understands urban fabric as an ever-evolving process. 3 questions, which were personally for me the take-home from yesterday, prompted a very robust discussion in the cities, in considering this collective visioning of the cities that we want. Who are we to want? What gives the legitimacy to want? What are we wanting? Are we wanting the I visions, or are we wanting a collective vision? And how do we want? Where do we derive the power to want? Do certain people take that power and execute the vision on others, or are we wanting collectively? And so with these questions, we arrive on the final day of the series, pondering all of these questions and this very creative and engaging space that we've had the last 2 days, but also asking ourselves a very important question. Do we deserve the cities that we want? The concept of deserving is a very contentious topic. It presupposes that we are deserving of a certain set of outcomes only where we fulfill the appropriate preconditions for obtaining these outcomes. Of course, the notion is antithetical to the fundamental and core concepts of justice and of people's rights to the city. However, history shows us that a consistent state of deprivation and disadvantage, which is unfortunately the vortex in which many African cities remain trapped and a vestige of the legacy of colonialism on the continent, removes hopes and aspirations, and for some, it removes the merit for deserving better cities. This is what the African Union's 2063 agenda sought to correct at what we would say was probably a regional and in some instances, a national scale. In describing the Africa that we want, the agenda has been described as Africa's blueprint and Africa's master plan for transforming Africa into the global powerhouse of the future. The agenda also alludes to integrated, prosperous, peaceful Africa driven by its own citizens. And while we must continue to laud this agenda for the aspiration which it so clearly sets out in ensuring that it delivers both quantitative and qualitative transformational outcomes for Africa's people, we must not be shy to critique the agenda and to admit that the agenda fails to take into account that these aspirations remain just that, aspirations, if they cannot be localized. If the ordinary, everyday person on the continent cannot vision at a conceptual level this emerging Africa. And so you are here in this space today, and I am here to re-envision this agenda in our cities, the place where true and tangible development occurs. And as we move into this session, I want us to re-emphasize that the first affirmation which we must take from this is that we are indeed deserving of the cities we want. For the simplistic reason of being, we are deserving. On this note, I will hand over to Dr. Brighton Nkrumah shortly to delve into a short input on the broader topic of our rights to the city, why we deserve the city. He sets the scene for what is to become a very vibrant conversation between the panelists who are here today and who I will introduce when the conversation is about to start. Following which, we will move into a session where together we'll have this creative exercise in which you are invited and I am invited to input into the process of re-envisioning our cities. And this is not just a process of re-envisioning for re-envisioning, even though that is valid. It's with a broader goal and a broader idea that coming out of this session and out of this festival as a whole, we're able to concretely input into what we hope will be a position piece to be shared with the African Union on the cities that we deserve. On this note, Dr. Brighton Nkrumah, I invite you to share your initial thoughts on the cities that we deserve.
Thank you so much for that instructive introduction. And I was quite, taken aback when I was listening to the discussions that have actually proceeded over the last 2 days. And my cue from the development and what you've actually highlighted, it actually ties into my small, pontification this morning regarding human rights cities. And to some extent, do we, as you said, are we deserving? In other words, are we entitled to the cities? But the question that we ought to ask ourselves is, what are we entitled to? And to some extent, or to a greater extent, it links into our question of right. And as you know, right is something that is often codified or enshrined in our national constitutions. But then their implementation is not done at the national level, but at the grassroots level, at the city level. And at the city level, it is often the city officials who are responsible for ensuring that what we are entitled to is actually fulfilled. If you look around the cities of Africa, spanning from Lagos to Harare, to Johannesburg or Cape Town, to Accra, you can see that there are very fundamental basic needs that individuals in cities often require. These may span from food to basic water, and of course, electricity. And I think that is something that at the moment as we speak, many cities in Johannesburg or in South Africa are actually facing. But the question is that, do these cities have the resources? Do they have the basic amenities to be able to fulfill these basic entitlements that we're actually asking for or calling for? And beyond the continent of Africa, it is often perceived that Africa, and as rightly intimated in the Agenda 2063, to many outside the African continent, the belief is that Africa by itself is not sustainable. That without foreign aid coming in to support African cities, the cities themselves do not have the resources to achieve the aspirations that they want. On the one hand, I would say to some extent, African cities or people in Africa, people on the geographic enclave called Africa, yes, to some extent, yes, Africans are poor. But Africa and African cities are not poor. The cities can be sustainable, but it's a question of how we utilize our resources. The cities so far have been unable to provide the basic needs to its people or to their people simply because of the misuse of these logistics at their disposal. So the question that comes in again was that, to what extent can we be able to realize or achieve the aspirations or the rights that we're entitled to? It's a question of accountability. And if one looks at the early genesis or the genesis of Africa's post-independent era, Africa was blessed with what we often call the philosopher kings. We had rulers who actually were philosophers, they were thinkers. And in your introduction, you actually mentioned the issue of bringing thinkers and actions together. Africa was blessed with thinkers, individuals who put the welfare of the people before theirs. And therefore, they were able to fulfill the needs of their citizens. But if one looks at the recent contemporary leaders that we had in African cities, which in many cases, municipal mayors, municipalities officials, one can see that the coin has turned on its head. We have now leaders who often tend to be much more self-centered as compared to being selfless to the needs of their people. But so the question is that what has actually triggered this kind of a shift? And that is because African cities or the appointment of local municipal officials is often triggered or is often brought about by a more focus on party affiliation rather than meritocracy. There is much focus on appointing leaders to cities or to head city municipalities based on their loyalty to the parties, but not on their ability to deliver on the promises that they make to the people. And there ought to be a shift in this direction. Otherwise, without it, there will be much talks on the ground, but in terms of translation into practice, it's going to be a very long way ahead. So the question is, how can we bring about a shift? How can we transform and make city officials much more responsible, much more attuned, and to be able to bring about maximum happiness or well-being to the people in the cities? And there could be three layers. The first one will be about active participation in decision-making. In most cases, you will see that across Africa, even the most astute, the most virtuous in our cities often tend to isolate themselves from decision-making platforms. That is because to some, they see politics as not part of their daily activities. So the good tends to isolate themselves from politics. And then you have the non-so-virtuous often leading political interests. So the first one is that if we want to see a shift, the virtuous, the philosopher thinkers, those with a will to be able to shape the destiny of people in the cities ought to be active in political decision-making. The second is about the use of courtrooms. I think we all know what we are entitled to. And when we speak about entitlement, which it's often a shorthand to imply human right, we are aware, to some extent, many people are aware of their entitlement, of their human right, but then they often tend to keep quiet when it's being violated. So the question is that without you pressing for your right, you are never going to be able to attain them, because the right or entitlement is not going to be handed to you on a silver platter. You ought to be able to press for them in courtrooms. Of course, there are instances where you have public interest litigators who will be able to take up the cases of those in cities and press for them. And perhaps that can be one avenue that can be used at this particular moment with regards to the ongoing electricity load shedding. Perhaps individuals can actually take that up. It's a very fruitful avenue for individuals to consider. The third one would be about networking among civil society organizations that are interested in assisting or enabling those in cities to be able to achieve their entitlement. There ought to be networking, there ought to be coordination for them to be able to collectively galvanize their effort and take to the street and display their discontent. I will profess these three key measures as an avenue to be considered going forward as a means of enhancing the human rights of those in African cities. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Nkrumah, for framing that conversation and giving us three key things to think about: active participation, the use of courtrooms, and also leveraging on networks and on partnerships to help to entrench the rights to the city. Before we move on fully into the discussion, I'd like to briefly introduce who our panelists are, and then we can start off the introduction. May I please kindly request that our panelists switch on their videos. First, you've heard from Dr. Brighton Nkrumah, who is a scholar and an activist at the Global Change Institute at the University of Wits here in South Africa. And then from the Green Africa Youth Organization, we also have Mr. Matthew Richard, who is the climate lead, but also the coordinator for Youth Climate Council in Ghana. Lovely to have you with us. We have also here Ms. Ntakwana Maema, who is the program manager of Aribi Group. We also have Dr. Sarah Kandirasi, the Associate Director and European Lead on Social Value and Inclusive Cities at ARO. Finally, we have Ms. Sinikiwe Kademonga, who is a disability activist and member of the African Women Leaders Network, Zimbabwe chapter. And welcome to all of you. I think I'm going to start this conversation with you, Sinikiwe, leveraging on some of the themes that Bright had put on board for us today, especially with regards to networking and leveraging on building a network of civil society organizations to help different people within their different clusters in the city. I think I want to ask you, from a disability rights perspective, what has been your experience with regards to the cities that persons in Africa who are disabled deserve? What has the lived experiences been? And also, what has the lived experiences with regards to forming partnerships from the ground up been?
All right, thank you so much for the opportunity. And I'm really happy that we named this session "The Cities We Deserve." Because I think just because we are citizens of our different African countries, we deserve better cities. So talking from an experience of an activist, as Africa, I can say that we are still far behind when it comes to having cities that are comfortable for everyone, cities that feel safe for everyone.
Hello, Sinikiwe. I think we lost her for a minute, but she was onto something there, and maybe, Sarah, I can bring you on board here to ask. She was onto this idea around comfortable cities and safe cities for everyone. And I know that you particularly deal with this idea around play in the cities and how we can make our cities inclusive for children also. Could you please give us your entries and your perspectives around building comfortable and safe cities for children?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, let me thank you for inviting me to this event. Also, because I think I'm the only non-African panelist, but I've been living across different countries in Africa for 12 years, and I'm still working in Africa from abroad. So my son also was born in Nairobi, so I feel Africa very close to my heart and my also professional expertise. So in terms of, correctly, as you said, within ARO, I've been working a lot, also with other partners like the Lego Foundation, on play in cities. And I think that when we think about the cities that Africa deserves, I think our cities where people of all ages and abilities basically are active and visible in the public space. They spend time playing outside, and they're free to move around. And also, I think is very important, are more in contact with nature. And design for play actually has the power to create cities that are better for not only for people, but also for nature. In fact, there is a lot of data and research now that shows that play is critical for children's well-being and happiness, and also for their healthy physical and emotional growth. In fact, through play, children, they can learn and they can develop different skills which are critical to thrive, like they can develop physical skills, social skills, creative, cognitive, emotional skills. And they can do that by engaging, by developing, you know,
in that field, your field.
So should I?
Please go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So so basically through play, you can develop by engaging in play activities or playful spaces, we can all develop these skills. In fact, play is not only good for children, but is good for everyone, also for grown-ups, youth, adults, elderly people, because through play, we can add joy to our life, we can relieve stress, and we can also help us continue developing skills. But there is, as I said, there is a lot of evidence, but despite this knowledge that the role of play in the well-being of people and learning experience of people is still undervalued, is considered something that is not important, and is not definitely prioritized in the way we design cities or the way we upgrade, regenerate city spaces also in African context. In fact, there is not enough attention, there are not enough investments on how to create spaces for people or for children in particular. There is not enough commitment from authorities, from development organizations, developers, and also urban practitioners working in African cities. so as a result, we are all missing out many opportunities to learn, to engage with others, to interact with people. And this situation is particularly critical for children, the millions of children who live in informal settlements, in refugee settlements across Africa, because they're living already in an environment which is lacking basic infrastructure, green open spaces, public spaces, and they are exposed to a great high level of stress, unsafe and polluted environments. So play could actually play a critical role to improve their conditions and to provide them opportunities for learning and for engaging with others. So because and I think also in addition for children, the benefits of play in public spaces for communities, because there is data showing that the moment you create a playful space, an outdoor space, actually that becomes a space for the entire community. For instance, we work with Ikalyami in Kalicha in Cape Town. We've been developing a network of play spaces in the township of Kalicha, looking at how we could also design playful spaces that enable the development of certain skills. So the design of these spaces is also very important. Another examples of our work it comes from Brazil, where we work with an organization which is called Estudio Mais through the proximity of care design guide project that we are doing. And there, what is interesting is that we also work in an informal settlement there, and we use we design the public space to promote breastfeeding, so that public space has not become only a space for public meeting or gathering, for women to feel safe when they breastfeed or for children to play around it, but it also became a space for advocacy to kind of push the message that you need to feel free when you breastfeed. So the fact of also designing spaces that becomes also spaces for influencing and changing the way we perceive certain habits or certain behaviors. So the change of behavior is also very important when we design public spaces.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that entry. And that was very instructive in the sense that what I hear from you is that this space is being designed, even though through the lens of children and of play, serves a greater purpose, and that kind of like flips this idea around that we should design cities from the lens of the most vulnerable. Because when we design cities in that sort of inclusive way, then it takes on board everybody. Designing cities for children, and it pays credence to a lecture I once listened around on designing cities for children, saying that the minute you design cities for children, then you design cities for everyone, vis-a-vis designing cities for everyone else or for adults, and then finding how to gradually network children into that. Timikiwe, thank you very much and welcome back. I'll give you the floor now. You had started a conversation around comfortable and safe spaces vis-a-vis the lived experiences of persons living with disabilities on the continent. Timikiwe, are you still there?
Well, yes, I'm here.
Okay, great.
All right. Thank you so much. So for me, the most important thing as an activist is we need cities that are physically accessible. Because as a person with a disability, when I wake up in the morning, the first thing that I need to think of is I just want to wake up. If I need to go to work, I need to go wherever that way I want to go, without thinking much into, so who is going to take me there? Because I cannot be independent in my city, whether it's Harare, it's Accra, it's Cape Town. I can also give you a very personal example. I attended my tertiary education at the University of Cape Town. Around the premises of the university, I was very comfortable. I was very independent. But the moment when I think of, I want to go to a shopping mall, or I want to go anywhere which is outside of the university premises, it was a struggle. And it became also financially straining, because now you need someone that you need to come on board and help you to move around. And I also feel like from an activist point of view is our authorities are also letting us down. Here in Zimbabwe, whenever there's something to do with developing the life of persons with disabilities. They say, we want to do this, we want to do that, we want to do this, only when resources allow. So for me, that excuse alone is, it cannot take us anywhere, because I feel like resources are not always allowing for us to do certain things, but there's just the need of sacrifice. And I also love from the last speaker who spoke that when you are designing our cities, we need to think from the most vulnerable person. And if you do that, it means the cities are now accessible for everyone. And also the issue of safety as well. Our cities in Africa, they are not safe. Firstly, because sometimes our systems are not working properly. We can just give a very big example of maybe like a traffic light. When a traffic light is not working properly, it is not really safe for me as a person with a disability, because it means when I want to cross the road, I just have to rush with everyone else. There's no traffic light that is guiding us. There's no one that is guiding to say maybe we have to cross in the next 3 minutes. So safety on its own is also very, very compromised. So I think our cities, they are just emotionally draining, physically draining. And I think as Africa as a whole, we deserve much better spaces that are very safe, very comfortable, and accessible to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Senekiwe, for that entry. And I'm going to come back and touch on much of what you said in terms of the current cities we have being cities that are draining and us deserving better. But in the meantime, I want to quickly go to Matei Richard. And Bright, in his introductory entry, had spoken about the key role that leadership plays. And when you look at the current trajectory of leadership across Africa, you think of leaders as being 60 plus, 70 plus, whereas we have a vibrant population of youth. So there's that mismatch already there. Senekiwe also touched on the role of leadership and the fact that the leaders which we currently have are not doing what they ought to do. And Bright spoke to visionary leadership. I want to ask you, from someone who works in youth spaces a lot, what key role do you think leadership plays in changing the current narrative of cities that we have, which from what we've heard so far, are not the kind of cities that we all want, and we're hoping to change that, to become sustainable cities, to become resilient cities, to become cities where there are green spaces for all, green spaces for children, spaces for the disabled, cities that are inclusive. What is the key role of leadership there to activate that?
Thank you very much. And I'm happy to be on this call and to join my colleague panelists. One of the key roles that I will start off with, to borrow from what Dr. Sarah mentioned, that when you build a play area that integrates or is for young people or children, I mean, you create an area for everybody. And it boils down to leadership integrating the views of young people, the views of persons with disabilities into policy planning and decision making. With that, it can help to create or bring together all stakeholders to brainstorm and come up with very innovative or pragmatic solutions or models that will help to develop our cities. Now, we are in a continent where the leaders think that they know it all, and therefore young people are incapacitated, and so their views are not supposed to be taken. They don't know what they want, and so they have to decide for them. And some also stem from the culture that we grew up with, where the elderly decides it all and knows it all and says it all, and therefore what the elder says is final. So we have come to a point where the views of other groups, like young people like women, like persons with disabilities, are not taken into decision making or are not considered when key or important decisions that transcends into developing our cities are concerned. And I want to also add and emphasize on something that Dr. Nkrumah also highlighted when it comes to issue of political will, that a lot of times there is not the political will to take on innovative solutions that are driven by young people, that are driven by other marginalized groups, which will be very helpful in developing our cities, just because these solutions are not led by the political actors and don't support their political agenda. And so a lot of times our development are driven by the political agenda rather than a developmental agenda, which encompasses or includes everybody and gives role for everybody to play a role or an active role in implementing these agenda. So these are some of the things that, I mean, require a systematic change, that requires a change in the thinking of leadership to be able to drive sustainable cities across Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mate. Thank you very much, and thank you for that entry. And you spoke about specifically development and how development is driven on the continents more by political agenda as against a developmental agenda. And on that, I want to come to you. Intakwana, I keep mixing up your name and I'm so sorry, I apologize. Perhaps I should just ask you, what's the correct pronunciation?
Intakwana.
Intakwana.
Yes,
Okay,
you can also call me Intax. It's okay. Thank you for trying.
Thanks, Intax. Yes, thank you. All right. So, leveraging on what Mate had said in the way we drive development on the continent, I just wanted to ask, when we think about informal processes as possible pathways towards driving development, what do we need to scale up and to legitimize in informal processes as opposed to deviations from the cities that we deserve? What are the things that we can do that from your experience on the ground you're seeing work in terms of scaling up development and development agendas?
Thank you for that question. I think one thing that we can acknowledge is that what we call informal processes, what we call microeconomic activity, these are already examples themselves of how people have used their agency in order to create and build livelihoods in the cities that we live in. And I must be honest to say that when I talk, I probably refer a lot to the cities that I've particularly lived or worked in, which is mostly kind of in Cape Town or South Africa and Lesotho. So I don't want it to sound like it's an African story, but it might be for all of us. And so what I feel is important when we are now designing cities that we want, and when we're thinking of cities as these places of economic activity, is how do we start to learn and understand with these existing activities that have happened outside of the so-called formal economy, what is it about them that we can learn when we are designing? And again, also, how do we include these types of activities when we think around the economy? Because oftentimes when we think of the economy, we are thinking of firms, we're thinking of internationalization, for example, and really most of the times when we're thinking about informal processes, we're thinking about how do we change the nature of how these solutions are done through regulation, for example, and our policies are not really looking at how do we enable and how do we enhance. Because as much as also we would like to celebrate these micro activities, we also have to acknowledge that there's precariousness that there's no protection, for example, in terms of social safety. There's no protection in terms of physical safety. There's no resilience and protection in terms of climate shocks or any other economic shocks that we have. So it's almost kind of trying to dabble with, how do we acknowledge and appreciate? How do we learn and really concretely take these activities and the people that are involved in these activities as experts that can inform how we design a developmental agenda, and not exclude them. So for me, that's something that I really value. And part of it, for example, is if we look at Stockfels and how they've enabled microeconomic activity, it shows a way of doing, a way of thinking, a way of creating, and a way of designing. How do we learn from that cooperative nature of working in the way that we design our policy, for example, and our economic policies? When we think about an African agenda, how do we think about cross-pollination between the cities and how we learn with each other? When we think around scale, for example, how do we embrace new activities such as digitization, such as technology, in order to enable that cross-pollination, in order to enable that inclusion of microeconomic activities into the broader context of the economy? So for me, that's where I feel there's a lot of excitement, and a lot of thinking needs to go also around how do we stop framing our solutions as a last mile solution. So how do we get, because these microeconomic activities, there's an environment and a context that's around them, right? And I love Sarah's sort of story around playfulness and happiness, and thinking around if we're having our spaces where we are running these economic activities at a micro level, are these spaces enabling me as a micro entrepreneur to be creative, to be agile, to connect to other activities that are at a different spectrum? How do I connect, for example, in the South African context, let's say from an entrepreneur, how do I connect into the metro as a source of activity, as a source of exchange? So we also have to kind of think around what is the system, external system and environment that is around these activities.
Thank you so much for that. And when I hear you, there's a lot that is going on a micro level, right? And there's a lot, we should be paying attention to most of that. But I think that the disconnect between what's going on down there and what's happening more at the city level and scale that up to national and possibly regional level is that there is no connection between what people are taking their agency and doing and feeding it into more national policies, more regional policies. Now, and I'm circling back to you, and I think this question goes to all of our panelists today, but starting with you, Ntax, how do you think that we can take, and this speaks to the question of scale. So scale, whether we're looking at activities happening at the micro level, or whether Sarah, for instance, is coming from activities, how we take play and build a city around play. How do we take this activities where we've seen Africans take on their own agency and actually begin to respond to real life problems, situations on the ground, and create their own realities out of nothing? But how do we package that and scale it and make it something that speaks to bigger developmental agendas, bigger developmental needs, and responds on a national level first, but on a regional level to many of the problems which we've heard today confronts us? Ntax first, and then Sarah, and then we'll go to Simikiwe. Let's take it that way.
Thank you for that question. I think for us, personally for me, and also from a Naribi perspective, one of the most exciting things is what happened this year at the UN General Assembly, where a resolution was adopted about recognizing the social and solidarity economy. Now, immediately, when you start to recognize an economy like that at that level, and it's an economy that includes different types of activities and spectrums, I think that is very encouraging. So then that's how we then start to integrate these different needs, these different drives and wants, these different levels of rights and belonging within this framework and the structure. So for us is then through this, then how does our policy speak to enabling this? And if we think about social, the words, and we think about solidarity, how do we build solidarity between the different scales? So scales can be between the small activities themselves or the local activities. It can be between cities, it can be between nations. And I think that is very exciting thing to see happening and to consider, and we need to take it seriously. Because now when we're also defining the kind of economy that we want to be seeing in the future, we are then able to start to design the right policy and the right instruments. We're also able to then start to advocate for driving of resources such as financial resources towards that. And more importantly, what is so encouraging around the idea of social and solidarity economy, and I feel to be clear and to put a disclaimer, we still have to define that from an African lens. What does that mean? Yeah. And then obviously at a lower level, at a national level, what does that mean? What I'm getting to is that what it means is then that you are able to then try to understand as an individual, how am I navigating this economy? And also it's an economy that embraces the different levels. It looks at social, it looks like economic, it looks like ecological issues. And how do we create institutions and new actors within this economy that are addressing these issues in an integrated manner? I think that is what is so exciting to me. And also, how then do you build an ecosystem or a system where you're building communities of practice, communities of understanding? Because once you also define the economy like that, when we are at the decision-making tables and the political agenda is being defined, you almost have to ask again, who is not here? And who is falling at the periphery of this kind of solidarity? And how do we include them? When we design in digital environments, for example, how do we design access to these conversations? And you know, sometimes I fear myself, like as an institutional representative, that am I really representing the wants of the entrepreneurs that we're working with? I much rather prefer to come into this platform and come to this platform with the entrepreneur, so the entrepreneur's voice is the one that's telling. Because it's also an opportunity for me to learn, because I think someone mentioned as well, is that we often don't understand the power dynamics. And maybe if there's already a relationship that we have with entrepreneurs, that maybe the ability to be vulnerable, the ability to critique what we're doing is limited. But now once it's opened up in a broad space like this, we start to hear those voices and visibility of solutions that are working. I would say that.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very instructive. Let me give on to Sarah first and then to Mate.
Yeah, thank you. I think, yeah, thanks for the great conversation which is happening here. I think, as you said, there are many micro initiatives that are amazing in Africa. I'm thinking about, I don't know, the work that the Fora Foundation is doing in Accra, where they're looking at nature-based play in public spaces. So there are OVPU in Kalicha, where they're looking at creating spaces for play and social gathering around water points, for instance, and many other initiatives. I think to move from the micro to the macro, so to upscale the great work that many organizations in Africa and beyond are doing to improve the living condition of people in public spaces. I think there are two main issues. One is a governance issue and one is a design issue. From the governance point of view, I think we're not talking to the right stakeholders. We need to involve and create a knowledge awareness about the importance of creating inclusive spaces among the stakeholders who shape cities, takes decision about cities, and is of course government authorities, national level, local authorities. We need to help them to have the right legal framework, the right structure in place, and to be able to enforce existing urban policies and regulations. On the other hand, we need to involve developers and investors, because at the end, they are putting the money to build cities in Africa. And in many cases, there are only few of them who are taking into account sustainability principles or design principle or inclusivity in the way they design, or accessibility in the way they design new real estates, new developments. So, and I don't feel that we are talking to them enough to be able to influence them, to have them on board in the way we design and create public spaces in Africa. So I think that's one. And then the other one in relation to governance is participation that came out very clearly from this conversation. We need to engage with all stakeholders, and not only with traditional stakeholders like from the government authorities or technical stakeholders. We need to talk with communities. We need to talk with the most vulnerable excluded groups in society. Children, youth, people with disabilities, women, because they, as we said, the moment we design for their needs, we're actually creating spaces that work for everyone. From a design point of view, as we know, there are so many challenges that African cities are facing, many vulnerabilities in formal settlements. So there are so many priorities that when you talk about play, for instance, it's like, okay, it's nice, but I mean, we need to be serious now. Let's talk about serious stuff. So but what I've been trying to do through my work, through our ARP's work, is really changing the way we can design for basic infrastructure, for instance, because at the moment, when we design for basic infrastructure, water facilities, sanitation facilities, we're mainly looking at the functional needs of people, which of course are important. But as you do that, by embedding some playful elements or inclusive design principles in the way you design them, actually you're also looking after their well-being, their healthy conditions, their, self-satisfaction. So it's really by changing the way we design these solutions that actually you can already have an impact. And the moment this way of designing these functional basic services in a way that looks after also their well-being and development as a person, and this way of design becomes like the way of designing or regenerating or upgrading from our settlements, that's going to be a huge change. And there are many nice examples happening in Africa, but how can we move that from like something nice to do that people do to something that actually is enforced in the way investors, development organizations, practitioners working in particular in formal settlements, they do this as business as usual. That becomes business as usual. So these are, I think, are critical way. And then so trying really to embed these principles into what we're already doing. So not to become too complex, because we don't want to add complexity in a situation that is already complex, because otherwise people don't want to listen to us. So how can we embed these principles in everyday's work? For instance, I know ICLE is very close, of course, to the importance of biodiversity and nature in bringing nature wild in cities. So how can we embed playful elements in the way we design nature-based solutions, for instance, or how can we rewild cities also, and when you do that, do it in a way that brings also some playful elements into the design of those solutions, because in this way, you, on one hand, through nature-based solutions, you have a huge impact for the environment, but again, not looking at nature as functional, but as part of our way of living. And at the same time, by adding play into the design of nature-based solutions, for instance, you are actually creating spaces for the society to thrive. So I think the key here, so is on one hand to have around the table key stakeholders who takes decisions and actually invest in cities to create a knowledge, provide them with tools and capacity to actually embed these principles into their daily work. So it doesn't become something more to do, but it's actually becomes something that they start doing as normal in their profession. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I take on board your point which says that we should embed the solution within what already exists. And Mate, I just want to invite you to reflect a bit on that. How are the initiatives that already exist on the ground, how can we take them and scale them up further beyond what's happening in the small little pockets around our cities? And like Sarah said, to begin to inform not just something nice to have, but being embedded as a way to say, this is the way we do it going forward here.
All right, thank you very much. I think one of the key things that we have to do in taking these initiatives from the ground and scaling them up is to have a platform where some of these initiatives can be shared abroad so that it can facilitate cross-learning. And so by that, for example, an initiative in Ghana can be known in Kenya and can be replicated in Kenya. And there can be that cross-learning to be able to understand what the challenges are, what the opportunities are, what are the requisite skills and capacity that are needed to be able to translate such innovative solution working in Ghana to a community in Nairobi or in Kisumu or in South Africa or in Namibia somewhere. So there's a need for us to create that platform, that avenue where we can share the various transformative solutions that are happening on the ground to facilitate that replication and cross-learning to be able to address the development challenges that we have in our communities. Number two is, how can we develop bankable ideas or proposals or financing pathways around these transformative solutions that are being led on the ground in the communities? Because it's important for example, a young person is championing, for example, in Gayo, we are championing a zero waste Accra project. How can we be able to model this project to be able to attract the right financial investment, to be able to scale up our zero waste Accra project, to move beyond the capital to other cities like Kumasi, like Tamale, even beyond the borders of Accra, to Abidjan, to Lome, to Ouagadougou, and to the border continent. So it's important that we are able to model the initiatives to be able to attract the right financing, to be able to scale them up. Another that I would recommend is the right policy frameworks to be able to so that these initiatives can leverage on these right policy frameworks to expand in scope. And it requires that young people or the youth or the women or persons with disabilities or the various groupings are able to get involved in the policy discourse, because a lot of times we see people push forward and say, okay, I want to get involved in the space. And because of the shrinking civic spaces and also the fact that people are not called, they feel, okay, let me just stay in my small community and keep leading on or pushing my initiatives. But here's the thing, that our governments or our leaders are pushing or the finance and the support that the government machinery can provide through the various policy initiatives and programs that they have set up. So if we don't get involved, if we don't bring our own seat to the table, if we don't create the spaces for ourselves to influence this policy program and these governance issues, so that the initiatives that are being led on ground are mainstreamed into the policy programming, we will not be able to scale up, because we will see that the government programs or the policies do not align to the innovative solutions. And we are currently experiencing that in our countries. And so there's a need for us to get involved in the policy frameworks, in the legal frameworks. And that is why it's important that we collaborate with each other. There are those who are much more involved in the technology space. There are those who are involved in the activism space. There are those who are involved in the policy space. And so there's a need for us all to come together as one, so that when it comes to the legal issues, the legal brains within the group or the network can understand, due to the peer learnings and the experience sharing within the group, what the needs of the technology people and the development people and the policy people are, so that he or she can put them together and shape the policy framework. Same applies to the legal framework. Same applies to the policy space. And the activists will also share their ideas and what is really happening on the ground, so that those actively involved in the policy would also gain those experiences and those knowledge and integrate them or share them, so that it transforms the policy space. And by so doing, we are able to ensure that whatever initiatives that are happening on the ground are really reflected or mainstream into policy, into programming, into legislation, and then the initiatives can leverage on these actions, programs, activities to scale. Because then when the investors are coming in, or the donors are coming in, they are mostly looking at what is aligned in the government policy, what is aligned in the legislative frameworks and all that. And these local initiatives are featured in and therefore can attract these investments and then scale up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mate, for that beautiful addition. What I hear from you is that first we need these platforms to facilitate knowledge cross-learning, but also beyond that is developing bankable ideas. And unfortunately, our expert on the financial aspect is unavoidably absent, because that was a major entry point that we needed in this conversation. But I think that we all can agree that many of these ideas stays as just ideas without the financing to back it up. And so we need to also have in mind within these conversations that there is a role that being able to mobilize financially from city level upward plays in actually being able to actualize this. And then finally, on policy framework and the involvement of different stakeholders within the discourse. And this is a recurring thread I hear with everybody who has spoken. And on this note, Bright, I'd like to bring you back into the conversation to just have a brief reflection from you first, and then from Sinekiwe. Bright, I understand that in some of the work that you've done, you've spoken and you've written quite a bit about organizing from the ground up and the role that people have in playing to shift the needle and to change things literally. And I hear you from a lawyer's perspective when you talk about the courtroom as another place to enforce these things. However, we all know that that is possibly the last option that most people would take in this larger continuum of possibilities. And so I want to ask you that what are practical ways to organize? Because the one thing that we all recognize on this space is missing within the discussion is the different voices. How do we practically organize ground up to ensure inclusivity in both our policy and our legal frameworks, and how we begin to craft a different level of mainstreaming these initiatives, but ensuring that we're not leaving any voices behind, whether it's the voices of children or the voices of the youth or the voices of disabled persons? So I would say Bright first, and then Sinekiwe, how do you organize ground up? And while Bright is unmuting, I'm not still sure, have we lost Bright? Hi, Bright. Can I please ask you that if you do have any questions, please post them on the chat function. I have seen another question coming quite recently for Bright, and after Bright and Sinekiwe have contributed to the conversation, then we'll take a round of questions. Okay, if Bright is not available here, Sinekiwe? Okay, we seem to have lost two of our panelists and to have lost both Bright and Sinekiwe. Ntax, can I put you on the spot and give that question to you?
I think that what I noticed, and my colleagues can or peers can correct me, even in the audience, especially in our context, it seems like it's so hard to work from the ground up. And I feel that what needs to happen, especially in our context, and following on what Matty was talking about, is we really need to start to organize. And when we think around organizing, is around in what way, in what form do we organize in such a way that we are able to use this collective power now to be able to maybe navigate our way up easier. However, my challenge is that it's more like the policymakers and the decision makers need to move down. Because sometimes for me, language, how we define things, the tools we use are easy to navigate because I'm already understanding how those frameworks work. But are they necessarily relatable to what's happening in the ground in terms of language and being able to engage and have a really authentic conversations? So it almost feels like we need to have this middle way or multi-level space where, yeah, these policymakers, and I always make the joke in the South African context, like, who's the policymaker? But anyway, the policymakers and the decision makers to come down and then the ground up and to meet and really to then be able to discuss and have those conversations. And when we hold those spaces, we have to critically think about when we talk about participation, are we only referring to representation or are we also referring to equity and understanding that are we creating an environment that enables people to show up, an environment that allows people to express themselves how they fully can and when they can show up at their best and they can be understood. And then obviously, I think from us to move from a dialogue space and more into action is to really start to work together. How do we develop the scope of partnership or the scope of collective thinking and creating an action and develop action plans that are designed on a common goal? But we know that as individual structures and different groups, we know that we're going to act on it in a different way. And how are we going to measure and understand that we are succeeding and we're going the right way or we're going the wrong way? And how often are we going to do that? I feel like sometimes maybe also in these spaces is that accountability is an element that's missing. And what are the mechanisms and the systems and the periods that we're using to account? So that, for example, in the South African constant is not on a 5-year basis because the political environment dictates a 5-year view. Also, how do we take a more long-term view if you're thinking around sustainability? Because our decisions and our choices today are going to be different if we're considering around a much more longer term. So that's the perspective I would add in this conversation, having been put on the spot.
Thank you very much, Ntax. And actually, that was an interesting perspective. Sinekewe, I see that you're back online, and I'm wondering if you heard my question. But Ntax raised something very interesting, and I want to throw that question back to you in case you're still online. Ntax, you said participation isn't just about representation, it's about creating equitable places for people to show up. And Sinekewe, I'm wondering that in the practical ways in which you need to be able to organize for people with disabilities to show up, how do you activate this? That is not just a question of, yes, a tick box exercise, a tick box exercise where we have persons with disabilities being in the room, just so we all feel good and we say, yes, they are in the room. But how do you actually activate their participation within spaces of very able-bodied people and people who are so used to being in the center, and help these people to be able to take their own agency and to bring those points on board? Sinekewe? I'm not so sure if she's still on the call. I'm sorry, everybody. Today we have problems with our speakers, and so we're going to just gradually navigate this space gently, but I'll come back to you, Sarah. Much of the work you do is centered around children. And there's the one thing, and I'm coming back to Intact's entry on participation, not just being about representation. And when you're thinking around designing cities for children, how do you activate that in reality, where it's not just about what Sarah, as an expert in this field, thinks is great for children? And because the context of children also differ and very wildly, what children, say for instance, in Western Africa will prioritize as important to them within their own spaces is different from what children in Europe will prioritize. How do you activate real children's participation within the context of designing and of planning cities for children?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a great question. I think it's so important because sometimes, as you said, we design on their behalf, thinking that we know what they want, what they wish, but that's not right in many cases. So I think it's very important through the life cycle of a project, from the moment you assess, the moment you design, also when you implement your solutions, that you engage in an active way children and communities. So you can do that in different ways, and there are many tools you can use, from like participatory mapping and design, using design options like drawing together solutions. In Cape Town, we ran a photo competition asking children to take pictures of where they don't like to play, where they don't like to see, or where they which kind of play they normally do when they can and where. So really to understand from their perspective what are their challenges, what are their needs. There are other examples from the Block by Block, for instance, from UN Habitat or Block by Block Foundation. I think you're all aware the way they use Minecraft to co-design with children or youth or communities the places where they want to live. We developed with Lego a methodology using the Lego bricks, build the city you want. So basically using Lego bricks to build what they want. So there are many tools which are available, or simply like a workshop, by using playful and a playful approach also to engage with them. And you can engage children also from 3 years old, also engaging with their caregivers. So the problem is not that there are not tools. The problem in many cases is that there is not the knowledge about those tools, or the capacity to implement them, or the money to do it, because that's a key issue, because we always talk about the importance of stakeholder engagement. But the reality is that in many cases, in many projects which are implemented in Africa and beyond, the money allocated for stakeholder engagement is only 0.009% of the overall budget. So there is no money to do it. And if you work like consulting or as a profession, you need to look, of course, at the budget. And make sure that you don't overspend. So if there is no money for engaging with stakeholders, engaging with children, how are we supposed to do it? So it's not just based on goodwill. There must be like a way that is structured and embedding the way projects are designed and conceived as well. So that I think is an important point. And then going back to the question you ask about disabilities and how to engage people with disabilities in a way that is real and meaningful. I can bring you an example from Uruguay, where we work with an organization. It's called Espacio Lúdico, which means playful space in Spanish. And they engage deaf children. So they did it in Montevideo, in collaboration with schools, with the organization working with the deaf people, with the deaf community, and they also created and designed with them also nice videos to show how much they have to say, these kids, how they using the sign language, how much they have to share if they could, if they can participate. And what we piloted with them is an installation to allow, that is like an interactive installation in public space, to allow people to learn the sign language. So it's also that a nice example on how you can translate and connect, create kind of a bridge between people who don't understand each other, or they want to share, they want to tell more about what they want and what they need, but they don't have the space to do that. And when Spazio Ludico organized a workshop in Montevideo in the community where they presenting the pilot installation that they developed, they were approached by the elderly people, and they thanked them because they said, by putting that people in the center of the event, you're putting all of us, because also us as elderly people, we are not heard. We are not part of the conversation. Cities are not designed for us. So again, as was said many times, by engaging the most vulnerable, excluded groups, you're engaging the huge part of the population. In particular in Africa, as you know, 80% of the cities are informal, and people are really dealing with very challenging situations. So the moment you engage them and you give them space and voice, you're actually addressing the needs of the majority of the population. So yeah, that's, I think, is quite important to do that in a meaningful way, and also in a way that is they can trust. So there is no point to go and engage communities and people and children if then you don't take their ideas into account, and then you don't share with them the final result of the project that was developed. Otherwise you lose trust, and trust is so important when you engage people. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that was a beautiful note on which to almost come towards the end of this conversation, where we recenter again the need to engage the most vulnerable, because when we engage the most vulnerable, and particularly in the context of African cities, then we engage majority of the population. On that note, I'm going to give to each of our panelists a 4 minutes period for wrap up. I'll start with you, Mate. And the one thing I want you to reflect on, taking from this conversation and from what Sarah has just put on the table, engaging the most vulnerable, recentering people at the heart of our development agendas. What do you think are the cities that we deserve in Africa? Mate, and then to Ntax and to Sarah. Bright, if you're on the call, please could you put on your video? And I don't know if Senekiwe is back on the call. Mate.
Thank you. I think that we deserve cities that are very inclusive and highlights our culture, our background, our identity as Africans. Because, I mean, there is a gradual shift from who we are to an unknown identity that does not help us as Africans to co-create and coexist with each other. And so there's a mindset of, I am different from this other African. But if we are able to create a cities that brings us all together as a collective, cities that highlights the African culture, that puts us all together as one people, it would help us to think alike, to be able to gather our resources together. It will help us to come together as a collective to design models to be able to create the cities that we envision, that we want to have. And so it is important, as we've highlighted in our various submissions, the need for us to come together. And in coming together, we do not forget our identity, which is very key. We do not forget that we are Africans, we are one people, we are not divided, we are not different from each other. Because when you look at the African culture, it resonates, a lot of things resonate across all the different cultures, from West Africa to East Africa to Southern and Northern Africa. And therefore, it's important that we identify that our culture makes us who we are. And so our identity is key in the transformation of our cities, in creating the cities that we want to live in and have as Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mate. And Tax?
Thank you for that question. For me, we deserve space or cities where it's a space where I, as an individual or as a collective, I'm confident that I can innovate, I can create, I can shape it. And it's cities where entrepreneurs, especially, are able to be, they're enabled, and that the physical environment, the social environment, the health environment, all the different perspectives, they're able to build livelihoods. I would imagine also, as we move towards the future, to start to think around circularity of wealth. So going away from the individual amassing this big amount of wealth, but how does wealth become a circular energy? And also that circularity isn't about rebuilding. I would also imagine, or I would love a city where we place the minoritized, whether it's or marginalized or vulnerable, the word or the nature that you describe, people or places at the center, and they're brought back into the city and the consideration and the perspective of the city. I'm thinking particularly when we use terms, and I do too, like informal economy, informal settlements, peri-urban. What exactly are we saying? Because are we already perceiving that they don't belong in the city? And again, around belonging is, yes, looking at the rights and the basic needs and that need products and services that need to be created in order to fulfill basic needs, but constraining ourselves as well, thinking around what is the environmental impact of this? What is the cultural impact of the solutions that we bring? And also, yes, I might get water. I remember in the reflections last night, I think it was Paul who reflected around, it's easy to fund things I can see. It's easy to fund water pumps, solar systems, because I can see them. Yes, then I have access to energy, I have access to water, I have access to food, but am I belonging? And do I have a sense of belonging in the city? So for me, it's around that. And another lens that we are starting to learn more around, because we're starting to center the girl and woman in its broad definition and sense, is that how do we bring about care? How do we bring around care in cities and as a framework or as a framing around how we make decisions, design, and create? So that for me, and those that are connected.
Yes.
I would leave it there.
Thank you so much, Tax. I don't know if Sinekiwe is on the call. Sinekiwe, are you there?
Oh, yes, I'm here.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. My apologies. I'm going to present without the video because I think my network is not really stable.
That's true.
So for me, the cities that we deserve are cities where there is harmony, where everyone is in agreement, where everyone is in accordance. So when I say everyone, I mean from the law or policymakers, from the education bodies, the local authorities, communities, religious leaders, even, like everyone, persons with disabilities, the vulnerable, which is women, persons with disabilities, and children. So where everyone is in harmony. We need cities where everyone feels confident to say, I'm going out there, I'm safe, I'm comfortable, I'm going to access whatever that I need to access. And then we need cities where everyone has a voice. Each and every person needs to have a voice in whatever that needs to be included in the city, whether physical reconstruction of the cities, the social aspect of the cities, the emotional being of the cities. Everyone needs to have a voice. And then you also need to put like the vulnerable at the center. So the vulnerable, we are talking about women, we are talking about children, we are talking about persons with disabilities. And I'm also going to emphasize on the issue of we need cities that are accessible, we need cities that are safe, we need cities that are comfortable to everyone, no matter your background, no matter where you are coming from, no matter your gender, no matter your physical being. We need cities that are comfortable for everyone.
Thank you so much for your addition to that. And finally, I would say, Sarah, what are the cities we deserve?
It's difficult to add more to what was just said. I think
I can
it was. But I think, yeah, of course, is a city where, as I said before, where everyone of all ages, of all gender identities and sexualities, of all abilities are visible in public space, and they have a voice to say, and their voice are heard and taken into account seriously. And is a city where all the basic needs are addressed. But knowing how difficult it is, as I said, a city that looks also beyond functional needs in a creative way. So how can we address basic needs, functional needs in a way that also help people to thrive and also takes into account the need for their well-being, for their mental health, physical health. So how can we bring the creativity that, you know, Africa is so rich into the design of these solutions? And I think also, as I said, this requires a cultural shift. It requires a change from business as usual, and it requires to have around the table and the key stakeholders who are shaping our cities, definitely the government, but also, as I said, investors, developers, who is putting actually the money, who's taking decision and creating cities. They need to be on board, and they need to work together, not in a silos, and to work hand in hand with local communities, empower local communities, listen to them, and implement so many at scale. There's so many great ideas that are already you know, available, not only in Africa, but beyond, from where we can learn as well. And I agree that the need for care, this approach for design, and I suggest you to take a look at the proximity of care design guide which we developed, which is actually looking at this, how we can create spaces for human relations, for caring, for supporting people living in there. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Relations, for caring, for supporting people living in there. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not really sure why we had that quick feedback, but thank you so much. On behalf of all of us on the Rise Africa team, I could not be more grateful to this panelist and to all of the conversations. There is so much to digest. But like I had promised at the beginning of this session, this is going to be a session where we co-create something that feeds into something. So we're all going to have a minute or two, but before we have that minute or two to feed into this larger document, which we're hoping to package together and send to the AU with regards to the cities we want, I want to just give us a brief again on what the panelists have said are some of the cities. And remember, we're moving from an I framework to a we framework, the cities we want, not the cities I want. And so some of the suggestions that are on the table currently are cities where our identities are central, cities where we can build livelihoods, where there is circularity of wealth, cities where the marginalized are centered, where care in cities is prioritized, cities of harmony, cities where we can live with confidence, safe cities, cities that are accessible, cities where all ages and all identities are taken into consideration, where all basic needs are met, and creative cities. And finally, cities which empower local communities. Taking on board everything we've heard over the last hour and a half, roughly, I'd like you to pause for a minute or two and think about yourself 10 years from today. And I'd like you to describe in one sentence, not more than one sentence. And so this is the practice of us learning to take all of these beautiful ideas and condense it into one very definitive point of the cities that we want. Understanding this is not just about you alone. This is about the collective. It's about the cities we want. And so I will prompt you to spend the next 2 minutes thinking carefully about what that city is, and spend 1 minute typing it out into the chat, but do not say send just yet. So can we say we have 3 minutes for this exercise on the cities we want? There's been a lot that's come from the discussion. There's a lot that we want. But how do you take all of that and tailor it down into one very poignant sentence on the cities that you want to see, or the cities that you believe we deserve 10 years from today? So if you're 20 and you're on this call, when you're 30, what city do you think you deserve? If you're 40 on this call, when you're 50, what city do you think you deserve? And I'm asking us to move away from our current frame, because there's a tendency to be absorbed in the now and to not think beyond the now. 10 years from today, what city do you deserve? And so you may be a youth today, but in 10 years' time, you are no longer a youth. What city will you deserve then? We have 2 more minutes for this exercise, not to post just yet, to think deeply, to type out. One minute on the clock. By now, you should be typing out your vision of the city you deserve. "30 seconds more. And the prompt is, we deserve blah, 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 blah. Not I deserve, because this is a collective. If you think we deserve happy cities, then the prompt is, we deserve happy cities. And we are down to the last 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Post. I am so excited about many of the visions I'm seeing here. Thank you very much for participating. On behalf of the Rise Africa team, once again, would like to say a very, very big thank you to our panel of experts and to everyone who participated in the 3 core sessions in the morning. Thank you to all of you who have joined us in this conversation. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for the side discussions on the chat. Would like to say a huge thank you to our panelists in absentia who unfortunately either couldn't join or had to drop off. We also say thank you. But more importantly, to you who is on this call, thank you and thank you and thank you. Everything that you've shared with us here, we would love to it to feed into our position statement to the AU. So in case you see your exact line copied in, know that it came out of this process, and we're appreciative of you putting thoughts into it. We'll invite you to attend the other sessions left for the rest of today. We have quite a fabulous lineup. We've posted into the chat the link to the sessions. So please look through it and decide which ones you want to join, or in fact, join all of them. This evening at 6 p.m., we have the final daily debrief. And of course, that will take on board everything we've learned so far at the Rise Africa Festival 2023. Until next year, see you and thank you very much. It was a pleasure having this conversation with you.